Hi, I'm very pleased today to be talking with Roy Pogorzelski. Roy has recently been named director of the Lowhorn Gathering Place at the University of Lethbridge, and many people may know him from his recent role at the City of Lethbridge as inclusion consultant. Roy has extensive experience with inclusion and racism and Indigenous peoples all over the world. He's just a wealth of information, and we're going to unravel the meaning of reconciliation today, talk about what it means to Indigenous peoples in terms of their health and what it means to the average person living anywhere. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the word reconciliation. What does it mean?
You know, this is a very interesting thing because since in my early studies in undergrad and when reconciliation became a term, you know, Australia was using reconciliation. Now here we're using reconciliation. Africa was using it. Rwanda was using reconciliation. So it's a term that's been around, and it's very interesting because if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they call reconciliation a relationship building process, building relationships to move forward from some of the trauma and policies of the past that have caused, you know, deep oppression on Indigenous peoples. But when people ask me and when they look at it, it's such an abstract term because reconciliation really means something different to every individual. And with a lot of people I have discussions with, they've often umbrellaed the term Indigenous or Aboriginal or whatever term you want to use to encompass one homogenous meaning towards reconciliation. Whereas when we look at, you know, the plus 600 nations of First Nations people across the country, you know, the over 400,000 Métis people that live across the country, and you look at the, you know, 40,000 plus Inuit that live in 53 communities in the north, we're pretty much talking a whole different meaning for different communities. The way that many of us have been impacted from colonial policies like residential schools, like the Indian Act, like a number of those things, when you look at that, it's affected communities differently, and it's affected families differently. So having one blanket term, I mean, you can go with the TRC term and say, yes, it is about moving forward, building relationships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples, but it's also just so abstract a concept. And I know that I can't give one concrete definition, but it's up for the individual to look at reconciliation and see what role they play within that and how that they see reconciliation moving forward. It is an awareness and an educational process, but it is also important for people to discover it in their own way, because our intersectionality of who we are as people is so different that I couldn't blanket that terminology for people or for Indigenous peoples in our country.
I know, to me personally, the word sort of conjures up mending, the word mending and forgiveness, and I understand about going forward, but is it possible to go forward without first mending the hurts of the past?
Well, and that's the thing. So one of our biggest reminders, especially in the process of moving a reconciliation implementation plan forward, is that we can't forget the truth in it. It's truth and reconciliation, and when we start to use this term, we can get caught up in the game of creating a buzzword. You know, a very nice, easy-flowing buzzword that allows people to see it and think good thoughts. When we forget the truth, we forget the actual traumas that's been caused by residential schools and that people are still healing from and dealing with, and the intergenerational trauma that's passed down to Indigenous youth. You know, when I see reconciliation, I see it as one of two things. It is mending relationships. The forgiveness piece is going to be a bit more challenging because, I mean, the government apologized. What happened there? Where did that get us? I think it's hard for certain survivors to forgive and forget because this is such now a part of their life and part of their healing journey. But, you know, one of the other things for reconciliation is it offers us an opportunity to educate about those truths and to bring them more out. You know, when I was younger, when I was an undergrad in university, the conversations were just starting to talk about this. That was in the early 2000s. You know, we didn't really as a nation do a great job of having these challenging discussions, and we still struggle with it today. It's not easy to listen to these stories. So advancing reconciliation, you know, from an optimistic perspective is very important. I think it offers us an opportunity to start educating and having really concrete, meaningful discussions on what exactly this is.
And so if we want to increase awareness, is the onus on each individual to educate themselves? And if it is, how do they go about beginning to do that?
Yeah, absolutely, Sherry. Every individual is responsible in reconciliation. Reconciliation isn't one-sided, and it's not the Indigenous people's responsibility, Métis, First Nations, Inuit, to advance this work. It's every person in this country is responsible, and that even includes new Canadians and refugees who find Canada as home. This is going to be a prominent part of their learnings as well. So it is to each individual. Now, starting that journey is different for everybody, and throughout the process, I've seen there's constant learnings. There's constant learnings even still for me in this role, and a lot of Indigenous people as we move this work forward, as we talk with our knowledge keepers, our elders, our rights holders in our communities, and we talk to them about this. We're constantly learning and discovering what reconciliation is. So for someone new to it, the first thing is just to start attending events. And I know this is it seems easy, but sometimes when you're not exposed to those events or you're kind of nervous about attending events, I talked to a young lady last year at Sisters in Spirit, and for years she thought, well, she didn't know if she could attend the events. She didn't know how she could support the efforts. And it was simple. Come on out. Promote it through your own, now social media is a big thing, promote it to your friends, have these discussions with your friends, and it opens your eyes, and you will start to have those discussions, and you'll continue to learn. It's a constant journey. So no one should fear the journey. They should see it as an opportunity to have these discussions with their friends, with their families, with people they normally might shy away from these discussions with. So it's not an easy journey.
No, and I think maybe it might require some courage in some cases where we might be called upon to challenge racism if we confront it in our community and things like that, to try to change the way people think about what they say.
Yeah, I think that's one of the overarching kind of discussions we have to have. There is a lot of ignorance around the history. There is a lot of discrimination around some of the stereotypes and myths that we see in our community. And so I think combating racism is paramount to advancing reconciliation work. We could not, that truthful component I'll continue to remind people of, but we cannot advance reconciliation until people themselves decide that they want to learn more. Right, and so everyone says, well, go and educate, go and get out there and educate all the people. People have to take the onus to want to know too. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with everything. I often ask the question, how do you know what you know to be true? Right? It's our basic epistemology, of the things we've learned growing up. How do we know that what we know is the truth? And I think until people can kind of look internally in themselves, start to decolonize kind of their mind and heart around the truth they may have learned growing up, and start to expose themselves and open themselves to new learnings, new knowledge bases, new ways of living, it's going to be hard. Right.
That's a nice tie-in to actually things are happening here in Lethbridge to enable people to take those steps. We recently experienced Reconciliation Week in Lethbridge for the very first time. And some events took place in the city. Kind of give us a rundown of what those were.
It was a great week. We started open with a pipe ceremony on City Hall, which was very meaningful, and it went into some opening remarks and discussions, and our first reconciliation walk. I think that's very important to walk down and see that kind of presence in our community. We did the flag raising, which was important. So the flag was created by the committee, and it was even the logo itself was created by the committee. A lot of discussion over that, which was great. And then we walked down to Galt Museum, where Beverly Jacobs, former president of Native Women's Association of Canada, and one of the leaders in bringing out missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, spoke for 40 minutes to us. What a great day of learnings. And throughout the week there was movie like Where's Home documentary done by Dan Berdesco with Mark Braverock and Martin Heavyhead. And what an opportunity to have a discussion around some of those intergenerational effects, some of the trauma, some of the mental health issues that come from these type of oppressive policies. And then throughout we had Cooking for Reconciliation, which was kind of neat. We had rights holders who had the rights to cook recipes, teach recipes, cook with others, and it was just a great way to get together. Reconciliation is really about putting us in that same room and having these discussions, and finally ending with a large blanket exercise, which was phenomenal learning. We had TPs that had information and sharing knowledges within them, and I think that people got really exposed to some unique aspects and learnings, and this is just the first week we've done, so we're very excited to continue to advance the work into the next. And we've got shirts printed up for Orange Shirt Day on September 30th, which is really exciting, and we've also got a banner and logos and really branding behind it so we can get the message out to the community.
You mentioned the blanket exercise. I just recently had the opportunity to take part in my first blanket exercise, and I just really want to encourage our viewers that if they ever hear about it, to encourage them to attend, because it was very impactful, very powerful exercise.
Yeah, and the facilitators are amazing. They do such a great job in getting the message across in a meaningful way, and I think a lot of people leave there very, very fulfilled that they've learned something that they can then pass on to their family and friends in their network. So it's a really, really unique opportunity.
Now, because this show that we're doing is about health, let's talk for a minute about reconciliation and how you see that it may impact the health of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, reconciliation itself, going back to that truthful aspect, in our communities we're dealing with the intergenerational trauma. We see the intergenerational trauma of these schools. We see people that are healing. Back before any of our elders, and even in my communities from personal, before my mom or grandma or anybody would talk about this back history, they would oppress it. They would hold it inside. They would never talk about it. That has an extreme effect on your mental health. Some turn to addictions to deal with and cope with the abuse that they faced in these schools. Nowadays, where we're open about the concept of reconciliation, and we're open about we're open about educating about what happened and having these discussions. Now the healing part begins, but the healing part is one element. We need services. There's some Indigenous people here who will say, you know what, reconciliation might not be for me. I'm out of it. I'm good. I'm doing well. Reconciliation might be for those people that are still healing or still suffering from trauma. Maybe it's for future generations. I don't have the answer to that question, but what I do have the answer to is that there needs to be more cultural supports, more funding towards those. That's the hardest part. If no one's willing to fund cultural programming for Indigenous people that are struggling with addictions, struggling with mental health issues, healing from the trauma of abuse, then it's going to be really tough to heal those folks and get them to a place where they can live a good life. And so when I think about the mental health effects, you see it everywhere. It's in our communities. It impacts our families. And just speaking personally, like my family's been heavily impacted from these effects, and most of them live in north central Regina, Saskatchewan. So, you see these every day, and you see subcultures like gangs forming, and you see those become the support systems, because there's just not enough going around for those type of mental health services. There's a lot going to mental health, but I haven't seen a lot going to intergenerational trauma, healing for people that have experienced residential schools, or even their children that have experienced the intergenerational effects of those schools. Yeah, and that's what I continue to hope to speak on, and I continue to hope to advocate for, because until the government offers, more services in that realm, it's going to be very challenging for communities to start this process. But I'm also hopeful that we can do it.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Roy. I think we're very fortunate to have you in our community.
Thanks, Sherry. Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching.